As you know, we started running When Radio Was with Stan Freberg on Sunday nights here on WJBC. I've always been a fan of it ever since I first discovered it many years ago. And old-time radio is, well, for many folks, the way really God intended radio to be. And I think Bill Owen is one of these kind of guys. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing great. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. Tell me about you. You've been in this game for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, I started out in the Midwest. I went to school on the West Coast and got into broadcasting and worked my way up to WLW in Cincinnati, and that was kind of a springboard after 3 years out there. Moved up to ABC in New York, and what was originally a summer job, just filling in for some of the announcers on vacation, got lucky for me and ended up as a 30-year career at ABC. I left there in 1990.
Wow.
And I went over to Channel 9, and right now I'm doing a radio broadcast, the Make Believe Ballroom, which was a big local radio show with Martin Block, and I'm doing that on another station since WNEW no longer exists. Mm-hmm. So I'm having fun, and on my own show I do a lot of reminiscing about radio. Of course, you have quite a connection there in the heartland there with Vic and Sade, because Paul Reimer, who created that show, came from Bloomington, Illinois.
That's right. In fact, he lived, for anybody who's listening, right near where Broman Hospital is located now, Paul Reimer. Not many radio shows actually had the writer's name mentioned in the title, but he did with his, didn't he?
That's correct. That Paul Reimer and Don Quinn stand out among radio's writers. I suppose you could add Norman Corwin and Arch Obler and a few others in there, but in terms of comedy, why, Paul Reimer and Don Quinn really did it all. Don Quinn was always given credit on Fibber, McGee and Molly, which he helped create with the Jordans. And Paul Reimer was a great practical joker. I've read quite a bit about him. There was a biography done, I think, by his wife some years ago. And he was quite a man. Now, that was Vic and Sade, for those who aren't familiar with it, was an afternoon program set in a serial drama format, 15 minutes long. But it was just light comedy. It was banter. Originally just this husband and wife who lived, as the announcer said, halfway in the little house halfway up the next block. But as the years went by, they started adding a son and Uncle Fletcher, various characters, and it was not a studio audience type show, so you didn't hear any laughs coming in the audience as you would on Fred Allen or Jack Benny.
Yeah, back in the very early days, I was reading something that said they didn't know whether they wanted the audience to be heard if they laughed, and in fact, for a while, way back in the early days of radio, they said, please don't make any noise. And
that's correct, and you know who changed that all about?
Was it Fred Allen, or Fred Wynn?
Basically, Eddie Cantor.
Eddie Cantor
came out of vaudeville, and he found he was very uncomfortable working in a room where he'd tell these little jokes and stories and so on, and he'd get no feedback from it. And he said, I want to do this in front of an audience. I'm used to people laughing, and that helps my timing. So he insisted, and that was a great boon for me personally, because, as I mentioned, I went to school in Southern California, and it was a quick half-hour or so trolley ride up to Sunset and Vine, where most of the big radio shows originated, either at NBC or down the block at Gower Street, and Sunset at CBS, and around the corner was ABC, which was then a fairly new organization, and then Mutual Radio. They were all in this one little area comprising 4 or 5 square blocks, and they had usually seats for some 200 people, and you could just walk in with no reservation or anything and see what's available that day. And I got lucky as the years went by. I saw Blondie and Fibber McGee and Edgar Bergen and just about all the great shows.
Wow. You mentioned Fibber McGee and Molly, and of course they came out of Peoria originally, Jim and Mary and Jordan.
Right. They had a different name originally. Let's see, what was it? We had another name. It escapes me at the moment. But he was playing a small-town grocer at that point, and that caught on fairly well. Then he worked on the smackouts. They call themselves the smackouts because he would just smack out of everything when a customer would come in. And then they worked with Don McNeil and the Breakfast Club for a while.
And that show came out of Chicago.
Yeah, a lot of shows came out of Chicago. A lot of people are not aware of that, even in the Midwest, that Chicago was a major production center. There were some shows that came out of Detroit, particularly 3 that come to mind.
The Lone Ranger, right?
The Ranger and Sergeant Preston and the Green Hornet. They were all by the same man, George Trendle. And Cincinnati originated a few. They had Ma Perkins for quite a while. But Chicago, for the most part, originated soap operas and children's programs. But they had quite a variety. I used to listen every Sunday night to the Chicago Theater of the Air, Colonel McCormick would always give some kind of a little speech about American history or something, and people would line up for blocks to get into the Chicago Theater of the Air.
Right.
New York had its period, but eventually just about everything wound up on the West Coast.
Right. Of course, we should mention half of Amos and Andy came out of Peoria, too.
Garzon and Carell. Oh, there's another one that had a name change.
They were Sam and Henry, weren't they?
Sam and Henry originally, and they changed stations, and they found out that the station wouldn't let them take along the name Sam and Henry, which certainly turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because for some reason that it just doesn't have the same sound as Amos and Andy has to us. But they started over, I think it was over WGN.
That's right.
Yeah, and then they moved over to WMAQ. Mm-hmm. I used to listen to them when they were on for Campbell's Soup in the early days. They had originally just a 15-minute program. And again, that one was without a studio audience originally. It really went through a metamorphosis. And they would just have this banter back and forth, and somewhat akin to Vic and Sade, they did all the voices and had no other characters, so just the two people, like Vic and Sade, Fibber McGee and Molly, the way they started. But as the years went by, they started adding other people to the cast, and for the female voices, Madam Queen and Sapphire and so on. So by the time I got to see Amos and Andy, it was a full-scale production with an orchestra and about 15 actors on stage.
And then, of course, they turned it into a TV show and then fired the black cast when they discovered that it was supposedly insensitive, which I never did buy because I thought it was a great show.
Yeah, well, a lot of people would agree with you on that, but it ran into a sociological roadblock and never recovered from that. But it probably, if you're going to narrow it down to the one great show of radio, I think that would be certainly a strong contender, and I would give it the vote, because that show just mesmerized America. You've probably heard the stories how movie theaters were going. They couldn't get anybody to come to the theater during the Amos and Andy broadcast, so they put up in the marquee that we stopped the movie to listen to Amos and Andy. Department stores did the same thing.
Amazing.
America stopped for Amos and Andy.
Let's break for a moment. We're talking with Bill Owen. There's a new book out. In fact, this is the second edition. The Big Broadcast, 1920 to 1950. If you're a radio fan, you would love this book. We'll tell you how to get it, and we'll talk more in just a moment on WJBC AM 1230. The Big Broadcast, 1920 to 1950. Actually, I think this is about the third effort you had at this book. Isn't that right, Bill?
Yeah, well, we started off with the radio's golden age, we called it simply, and it was kind of a skeleton. We didn't know that we would have later editions at the time. We were just gathering material. In fact, if you go back in our mind, it was going to be a pamphlet. It has a rather interesting origin. Frank Buxton and I were on a television show. He was the host, and I was the announcer for the Ritz Theater in New York, and as you know how television shows take many, many breaks, and during these breaks, while we're killing time, we started testing one another's memory. We found out we had a common interest in the old movies and comic books and radio programs, and one day we got into a mild discussion over who played what role, and I said, "No, Frank, I think you're wrong. Let me check that out. I'll go to the New York Public Library tomorrow." So I went in the next day and walked up between the two majestic lions, went in and asked for their books on old-time radio. I thought she'd bring back about 20 of them. She said, "There are none, sir." I said, "What?" Turned out no book had ever been written on old-time radio at that time. This is the early 1960s, and radio had only been really out for about a decade or so. So I went to the various networks. NBC had that excellent file of old dog-eared cards. Nobody had looked at them for years, but they allowed me to go through their section. I got a lot of information from that. I went over to CBS, and they handed me their complete collection of radio history in a little index card box. They had a few cards in there. I went to ABC, where I was working at the time. They gave me a manila envelope with a few clippings. That was all they had from the past. And Mutual, sadly, which had so many great programs, especially for youngsters, said, "We don't have anything." I said, "Nothing? Not a nothing." So radio disappeared. So Frank and I came along at a very good time, apparently, because a lot of these people were getting up in years, the writers, directors, actors, and so on. And a lot of them have passed on since then.
Right.
And if we hadn't interviewed them, who knows, this information would just be scattered to the winds, apparently.
Yeah. I had a chance to interview Arch Obler, and boy, he could scare you to death, couldn't he?
Oh, well, that was one show. I can't comment too freely on that one because At the time I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to listen to it. It was my parents would say, "Oh no, Billy, you can't listen to Lights Out." My two older brothers were allowed to. I guess they were like 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
And I would pretend I was asleep, and I'd go to the door and put my ear to the door and listen, but it didn't do any good. All I could hear was the kids commenting, and I'd hear a scream once in a while. So I have to use my own imagination as what it was like, except for the few recordings I've heard of it.
Yeah. There were so many great shows. One of my all-time favorites, in fact, I guess my favorite comedian would have to be Jack Benny, although I think Fred Allen, who we got in feuds with on radio, was, wow, what a talent Fred Allen was.
Right. The feuds are interesting. A lot of people really believe that Fred Allen and Jack Benny had a serious feud. You know, they had a boxing match one time, supposedly scheduled at New York's Hotel Pierre.
I didn't know that.
And it never came off, but people really thought they were going to have an actual fight. Like Ben Burney and Walter Winchell had a great feud going on. They were, of course, great friends.
Mm-hmm.
But Fred Allen, he came out with one of the greatest stories. Actually, I heard it from Don Wilson. Don Wilson was at one of our radio get-togethers a few years ago. He's since passed on, as you know. And he was Jack Benny's announcer for many, many years.
Right.
And he told a story to our group there about the feud and how Fred Allen would listen to Benny's broadcast and make a comment if he could to try to top him, and Benny would have to wait a week to come back. Well, anyway, one night Jack Benny announced that he was very serious, that a tree had been planted in his honor, it was the Jack Benny tree, at his school in Waukegan, Illinois. And he was quite thrilled with it. So I guess that burned Fred Allen a little bit, and he couldn't think of anything to say. A few weeks go by, according to Don Wilson, and Jack Benny comes on the end of the show and says, the tree I told you about in Waukegan, Illinois at the school, I'm sad to report that it died. So that triggered Fred Allen's response. He came on and he said, No wonder the tree died in Waukegan, Illinois. Its sap was out in California. They just carried on wonderfully. Of course, there was Allen's Alley, which is you could do a whole program just on Allen's Alley, and Senator Claghorn with his, somebody's a-knocking on my door.
And Johnny Carson, of course, had his mighty Carson Art Players, but before that, you heard the mighty Allen Art Players.
That's correct. Hey, you're up on your material.
Up on the Fred Allen Show. And, of course, he wrote so much of his own stuff, too.
That's correct. He was the master of the ad-lib, and a lot of the ad-libs, of course, got him in all kinds of trouble. He was always mocking the vice presidents at NBC, and his wit was incredible, and he lived a very simple life. That was interesting about him. What was it? Some of his comments. You could take all the sincerity in Hollywood,
put it in a gnat's navel.
Yeah, I've heard flea, but I guess gnat'll work. Gnat's navel.
Still have room for 2 caraway seeds and an agent's heart.
You've got it. You've got the whole thing. And he once described a vice president as a man who comes into his office at 9 o'clock in the morning, finds a molehill on his desk, and it's his job to make a mountain out of it by 5 o'clock.
I like that, too. And he wasn't crazy about California or movies or TV, was he? I mean...
what do you call TV really did him in, along with the big quiz shows. That was another thing. In fact, when Stop the Music came on with Burt Parks, it was so successful, and it was just killing him in the ratings, and he actually offered, if anybody missed a call on Stop the Music and had a shot at the jackpot, he personally would pay what they would have gotten. But even that didn't keep him on the air.
I think it was another Fred Allen quote. He said, television is called a medium because it's never well done.
That's exactly it. Oh, what a great gentleman with the words. And,
he really was.
And yet, his humor, I've listened to a lot of it in recent years, it was so timely. It doesn't hold up as well as some of the Jack Benny things.
Unless you really know what was happening historically at the time.
Right. Whereas Jack Benny's material is just... still works. He goes to a football game or a movie, and they make fun of him and so on.
Yeah, for my money, I am a real movie buff. I love old movies and stuff, but I think, for my money, the best entertainment that ever came down the pike was the Jack Benny radio show. I just think it was fantastic.
Well, they say he could get more out of just saying, than most comedians could in a half hour.
We're going to break in a moment. We're talking about the big broadcast, 1920 to 1950. Bill Owen is on the line. He and Frank Buxton put it together. It's actually in the second edition, and it is loaded with all sorts of information about the great radio shows from the golden days of radio. We're back in a minute on WJBC in Bloomington. We're back talking about the great days of radio when men were men and horses were coconut shells.
Well, you've touched on probably the most important people of radio were not the actors, not the announcers. I wish I could say they were the announcers, not the musicians, not the writers, not even the directors. The most important people really were the sound effects. We said men in those days. They had a few women. But the sound effects people, because they made the broadcast, literally, and if they weren't doing their job right, it never worked. They were so good they would not only have footsteps, but they would have woman's footsteps, or you could tell by listening to the footsteps whether the person was panicked or whether they are leisurely strolling down the street. And Jack Benny, particularly, you were talking about him before, he insisted on personally supervising the work of his sound effects people. For example, when he would go down to his vault, it was very important, and nobody just walked in and said, "I'm a sound effects man, I can do the show." He was very rigid on that.
In fact, wasn't it his show, Bill, that probably used sound effects to the best advantage at the earliest, really, I think.
Well, a lot of them did, but the terror shows, of course, were highly dependent upon that. In fact, Hyman Brown said he was going to make a star out of a creaking door. There just happened to be a door at CBS that made a lot of noise, one of their sound effect doors.
Yeah.
And instead of oiling it, he said, "Wait a minute, I can use that." And it turned out to be the door for Inner Sanctum, where Raymond Edward Johnson would greet you each week with,
that's true.
"Welcome to the Inner Sanctum."
I guess really what the Benny Show is known for is the fact that it was actually like one of the early sitcoms where people just didn't tell jokes, but it was situations, right?
Yeah. I would also nominate, along with the creaking door as the most important sound effect, probably the little tinkly bell that ended Fibber McGee's opening the hall closet every week. that was the majesty of radio. It was so wonderful. You knew exactly what was going to happen in most of these situations, and you somehow each week would say, "Oh, I hope Molly talks him out of it," And she'd say, "Oh, don't open that hall closet door." And of course he would, and out would tumble everything under the sun. And never failed to get a response from the audience week after week.
We talked about Fred Allen taking on the sponsors. Henry Morgan was pretty good about that too, wasn't he?
Oh, in fact, he wrote the foreword for our book, and he would say anything that came into his mind, and he got in a lot of trouble with Lifesavers, one of the sponsors. He implied that they were, he put it, mulcting the public because of the hole in the center. And one of the biggest problems he had was with the Schick razor people. And they had a slogan at that time, "Push, pull, click, click, change blades that quick." And at one point he said, "Push, pull, nick, nick." Turned out that Schick had no sense of humor about that. And of course the elevator shoes, he was talking about Old Man Adler and his elevator shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And, another aspect of radio, there's so many directions you go when you're reminiscing about radio, but the catchphrases that have stayed with us down through the decades. And all I have to do is say the weed of crime bears bitter fruit, and
you think of the Shadow.
Exactly.
Or if you want to buy a duck.
Of course, Joe Penner. And that's interesting, too, how that began. He had just thrown that line out, but he would throw out different animal things, and he was on tour in the South one time in Alabama, and he had tried, you want to buy a cow, you want to buy a horse, and so on, and he didn't get much of a response. And one night he said, you want to buy a duck? And the audience howled, and he says, "I guess I'll keep that."
There were all kinds of...
He didn't live very long. He was with us for a very short time, but he certainly left his mark and gave us a great legacy. Some of the other things that some of your listeners might remember would be, "Are You Ready, Hezzy?" That was on the Hoosier Hot Shots on the National Barn Dance before they went into their slide whistle.
Right.
"Are You Ready, Hezzy?" And one of my favorites, and you don't hear a lot about him anymore, he's kind of fallen into the shadows of the mists of time, but Al Pierce had a program. He had a wonderful group around him. Tizzy Lish was a man that played a woman, and she'd give ridiculous recipes, and she'd always say, "Hello, folks, I'll wait while you get a pencil." But the bit, Al Pierce's bit, was he was a shy door-to-door salesman, which is a contradiction in terms. But you would hear the sound effects man knocking on the door, you'd hear that knock, and he'd say to himself, "Nobody's home, I hope, I hope, I hope." And, you could relate to that if you were a shy person. We just loved listening to that week after week.
Yeah. There was another one, "For the Love of Mike," which was Spike Jones.
Yeah. I just played a Spike Jones on my program today in New Jersey, and it's Der Fuhrer's Face, which swept the nation in 1942.
Yeah. That's a great stuff. George Rock, who played with him, I became pretty good friends with George. He moved back to this area. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he did the vocals for Oh, All I Want for Christmas Is My Two
Right, I
Front
remember
Teeth.
that one.
And he played trumpet for Spike Jones. But
I saw one of their concerts one time at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, and I don't think anybody ever had a bigger hold on the audience. They had that audience in stitches for 2 hours.
It's amazing.
Doodles Weaver.
Yeah, great group of people, right?
Yeah.
It's time for us to break one more time. We're talking with Bill Owen, and we're talking about the big broadcast, 1920 to 1950. Great memories. Even if you've never experienced some of these shows, you read about them, then you want to hear them. It's great. Hang on. We're back with Bill Owen. We're talking about the big broadcast, 1920 to 1950. The second edition is out now. I'm going to show my ignorance here, but I know Albert Brooks. You know, his real name is Albert Einstein, and his father was on radio. Do you recall who his dad was, Bill?
Albert Brooks' father?
Yeah.
Not offhand.
It was some kind of Ishkabibble, I want to say. Was Albert Brooks' father?
Ishkabibble was played by Merwin Bogue, and he just passed away a couple of years ago.
It may not be the right guy, but I know Albert Brooks' father was one of the guys who was on radio.
I wonder if his name was Brooks.
I don't think so.
Merwin Bogue played Ishkabibble on the Kay Kaiser program. That was another big show. Wednesday nights on NBC, the College of Musical Knowledge. Another thing that came to mind I heard Howard Duff some years ago, the late Howard Duff, refer to how people really got into the roles. And he was doing a program, and an actress was late for her cue. And turned out she was changing costume because she wanted to go from one role to the other. And she actually missed her cue, even though it was a radio broadcast with no studio audience.
Can happen.
Yeah.
I was trying to come up with Albert Brooks' real name. It's Einstein, Albert Einstein.
Well, that's correct. You mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I wonder, you know who that probably would have been? Would have been Harry Einstein.
Did he play a character on radio?
Harry Einstein played Park Your Carcass.
That's it. Park Your Carcass.
Meet Me at Parky. Well, he was on Eddie Cantor for a long time. He played a Greek restaurant owner in Meet Me at Parky's, a Greek American, and he just had fun with the English language.
I'm glad I brought that up because I'd have been scratching my head forever.
Harry Einstein, another one who was with Eddie Cantor, one of America's favorite entertainers. Only a supporting actor, never had his own show, was Burt Gordon. He played a character called the Mad Russian, and Eddie Cantor would always give him a wonderful lead-in. He'd be looking for somebody, say, I need to meet some tall, handsome man who can play this part or something, and then you'd hear this, how do you do? And he always called him the Russian, but it was the Mad Russian.
Yeah.
The characters of radio were just so fabulous.
They really were. This is a great book if people want to get a hold of it. How in the world do they do that?
Well, there's an 800 number is the easiest way. Bookstores usually don't carry this kind of a book so often. You'll find it at a few stores, but any bookstore will order it for you because they all know of it. But it's not the kind of book that sells 100 a day and then it's gone. It's going to be around a long time. So if you want to get a copy now, you just call toll-free 1-800-462-6420. 462-6420, and it's Scarecrow Press. Okay. And if you enjoy radio, everything is in there, as Henry Morgan said in the foreword. Everything that's left is within these pages. One of my favorite shows, before we go, I just used to love to listen to a program called The Whistler, and some of your listeners may remember that.
Sure, yeah.
It's such a wonderful opening. I am the Whistler, and I know many things, for I walk by night. And it was so chilling when this actor would come on with those words.
And then you'd hear that whistle.
Yeah, the whistle. Something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder what, well, in fact, I was talking to Frank Nelson one time, and he said radio just didn't die on its own. They did everything they could to kill it. Do you sort of agree with that? They took the best writers, they moved them over to TV.
Yeah, that happened, and radio made its attempt to stay on. They had something called The Big Show on NBC, one last gasp, and they spent all kinds of money. CBS raided NBC, and they were just in disarray. Everybody saw television coming, and I think they thought it was going to replace it, and they didn't realize it's a totally different medium, and it's rather tragic that it didn't happen. And a lot of the people did not make the transition well to television. Fibber McGee Molly was a complete bust, and Edgar Bergen didn't work out well on television.
Because you could see him move his lips.
Yeah, but people were so excited. The tenor of the times was people were so excited about this new medium, and now we can see them. And of course, it ruined it. Inner Sanctum is a classic example of this wonderful terror program in which we were frightened listening to it, but it was so exciting, and they put it on television, and it was laughable. There was nothing to be frightened about. It was just all there.
Oddly enough, the Benny Show made it because everybody sort of looked like you thought they might.
That's right. Benny was a notable exception.
Yeah. Fascinating look at radio. In fact, what was the last network show? Was it something like Gunsmoke or something like that?
Well, Gunsmoke was a late entry, but yours truly, Johnny Dollar, was probably the last big dramatic program on radio. That went well into the 60s. But a few made it, staggered toward the finish line. But between quiz shows, the big jackpots, and I do have one more anecdote about Jack Benny. It reminds me.
Okay.
Take It or Leave It was also known as the $64 question, and there was big drama when they would have a $32 correct answer. Now the question was, are you going to go for the 64? And the audience would say, you'll be sorry, and all this business. Jack Benny was a guest one time, and he didn't make it. He got his $32 and then missed on the 64. And he was complaining about it the next week. They said, Jack, you didn't get the question right. How can you complain? He says, I did get it right. They said, do I know how many such and such, some long involved thing? And he says, I gave the right answer. I said, no, I don't know. And he was wonderful.
It was great stuff. It was a great time.
Oh, yeah.
And you can read about it in the big broadcast, 1920 to 1950, by Frank Buxton and Bill Owen, second edition out now. Thank you very much. I hope we get a chance to visit down the road again sometime.
Okay, anytime, Ken. Thanks a lot.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.